Good. Well, thanks again for joining me, Dr. Franklin. I have my guest this afternoon is Dr. Charles Franklin, who's the director of the Marquette Law School poll, which I was wanted to ask you to start. You've been doing this a long time. Gosh, I can remember hearing your name for a long time for these surveys, and
Yeah,
just interested in hearing a little bit about the history.
sure. Um, well, we started the Marquette Law School poll in January of 2012.
Okay.
And so this is our 12th year of doing the survey.
Okay.
Um, we've done, well, we've got one coming out at the end of June. That'll be our 79th statewide survey and our 21st national survey.
Oh, wow.
So I hadn't thought about that, but I guess that adds up to 100.
There you go.
so,
You got to
so
have a
there you
little
go.
anniversary party.
Yeah, maybe.
That's good. Well, it's interesting you have a national footprint, and I know that's not only because Wisconsin is such a key player in electoral politics these days.
No, we are in the right state at the right time, if you want to think about it in those terms. You know, the state that is one of, if not the closest state in the country. Georgia and Arizona were a little closer than we were last time, but we were interestingly, we were the pivotal state in both 2016 and 2020 for the Electoral College.
Wow.
And, this year, it's not clear where we'll end up on the Electoral College, but certainly in the usual handicapping, everybody has Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania as the three pivotal states, with Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada as also important swing states. Um, as I said, Georgia and Arizona were a little closer than we were last time. Nevada was not so close. But we'll see how things shape up this year.
Yeah, well, fascinating stuff. Thank you. And again, thank you for joining me and talking about school funding in
Sure.
particular. We had a chance to chat a little bit last time we talked. And I wanted to look at five main areas with regard to school funding: taxes, lowering taxes versus raising education funding. That you've got really fascinating data there for over a decade. Then you have a question about school satisfaction related to a community, support for vouchers, special education funding, and then I wanted to get into a little bit of the issue of education as a key issue in sort of the priority levels of issues for voters. So let's start at the top again with this sort of bimodal question. Do you want to lower taxes? Or do you want to improve education funding?
Right.
I know that's something that has been very interesting, and it's particularly related to property taxes.
Right. And we ask about it that way because property taxes are, of course, key to school funding, though they're also controlled by by the state legislature. So it's a complicated relationship. Nevertheless, the arguments over this last dozen years or more have from time to time focused on holding down property taxes and what does that do for funding for K-12 schools. Um, so starting back in 2012, we began asking the question, um, which is more important to you, holding down property taxes or increasing funding for K-12 public schools? Um, and back in 2012, when concern about property taxes was especially high in that period, we had slightly more people saying it was more important to hold down property taxes rather than increase school funding. It's like 48 to 46 or so, with a small percentage saying they don't know. But in the next few years, that reversed sharply. By early 2015, we saw a substantial majority saying they preferred to increase K 12 school funding, and that was up in the mid to upper 50s by 2015, while holding down property taxes had fallen into the low 40s. And then over the next few years, that trend actually continued with further increases in support for funding for K 12. and property taxes dropping down into the high 30s, actually.
Oh,
Um, and that sort of major shift took place by 2016, 2017. In 2018, the trend started to reverse. I think in part because of the governor's race that year, in which Governor Walker emphasized his success in holding down property taxes, but making that an issue in the campaign. And so, starting in the fall of 2018, we see a rise in concern with property taxes, a decline in support for school funding. That's been coming steadily down until, but still with more support for schools than for property taxes. But in our latest surveys, we've seen a majority saying they're more concerned about property taxes and fewer concerned about K-12 funding. So
so
we're back now to roughly where we were in 2012, with a little more concern for property taxes, a little less concern for school funding, though it's still a relatively close race between those two. But it is a big change. If you just think of the arc of that over the years, school funding went up until 16 or 17 and has come down back to where we started.
yeah, and it's fascinating to hear that. And one of the things we had chatted about a little bit was the idea that the perception of what's happening with property taxes may not match the reality on a grand scale, and that's partly because the legislature, as they have raised revenue limits and funding, they have also put more money into the aid formulas and into the school levy credits. So even as a school district is able to have more funding and more
Right.
revenue, a fair amount of that is coming from the state.
That's right. And you got to start with the presumption that school funding is fairly opaque, even to people who try to follow it closely. And for the average homeowner who gets a property tax bill, they don't think, or they don't have the information in any kind of detail to know what this is really doing to school funding, what it's doing just because their home values maybe went up. Then there's some equalization and all these complicated things that happen with taxes. We do know that people are sensitive to what their total property tax bill is. And when that was pinching more in 2012, in the wake of the Great Recession as well, so financial difficulties for a lot of homeowners in that period, people are sensitive to it and it became more of a priority. I think the turning point that we see, though, as I already mentioned, this trend started in 2012, but in the first budget of the 2015 budget cycle, that proposed new cuts to K-12 funding that were quite unpopular. Leaders in the legislature quickly disavowed that proposal from Governor Walker. But it also was a time when uh, citizens, mostly parents, but people organized to say, stop cutting funding for the schools, that Act 10 had changed a lot of things about schools. But there was a sense in that 2015 budget that there was still more cuts coming for public schools that people got pretty riled up about. And you could see that in the legislators backing off so quickly about actually doing any further cuts. But I do think that was an important mobilizing moment beyond the controversy over Act 10, which is a different set
Right.
of issues.
Yeah.
But by 2015, the union issues were behind us, and now it was simply a matter of whether our schools have enough funding for them, and that became controversial at that point and boosted support for school funding.
Well, and interestingly, right now, I think there are a couple things playing out. One is inflation, right? And schools
Yes.
are making, I think, a very cogent argument that to keep the doors open, to keep staff in place, they need inflationary increases, which are substantial in many cases, or as we've seen the effect of inflation over time. The other thing is keeping those experienced staff members in the schools. And that has been, from working in schools, I'll tell you how challenging that is, keeping people in special education positions that are hard to fill, all kinds of positions, science, technology, engineering, and math positions that are very hard to fill. And you get these mid-career professionals, these people who have, a teaching degree and maybe in their late 30s, early
Yeah.
40s, and they're really hitting their stride with being skilled educators. But gosh, honestly, Quick Trip is paying $100,000 a year for a truck driver, and that's maybe twice what they're making in the schools.
This is a perennial problem with education generally, certainly public K-12 education. Um, if you got to fill the gas in the gasoline tanks and the buses,
Mhm.
gas prices are up, paying salaries, a lot of pressure to increase wages, especially with this recent round of inflation.
Yeah,
Um, Opportunity costs, as you say, you can stay teaching in your current salary and not expect large increases over time. Or if it's not too late for you to change careers, there may be opportunities out there that pay more.
right.
And in part, we used to deal with this in kind of shielding teachers with good benefits, good pensions, some things that were sort of golden handcuffs. We didn't pay exorbitant high salaries to the teachers at any time, but we did provide security and benefits and a certain limitations on how easily they could transfer from one school to another. In this more competitive era, where schools do compete to hire science or math teachers, or do compete for um, the amenities that parents really value in schools, all of those costs go up. And inflation is a big driver. And again, just as families have been sort of shocked by high inflation over the last 2 years, which if you're under 55, you didn't really live through the high inflation in the past as an adult. You may have been a child, but as a full adult, the inflation of the late 70s, early 80s, you got to be getting on up there in age. So I'm just saying this was a big shock for family budgets, but it also is a shock to those like teachers who are on mostly government provided salaries
Yeah.
where rates of inflationary adjustments to salaries are much rarer in the in the public sector than they may be in at least some private sector businesses.
Yeah, 3 to 5% raises in the last couple of years. My son teaches chemistry actually out east,
Oh,
and he was kind of struggling with that. They were offering a 3% raise, and he said, "Dad, that's not even keeping up with inflation. I mean, what's that about?" We
exactly.
also we commissioned a study from an organization in Boston who has Wisconsin roots, but we were looking at the differences in revenue limits, and we were looking at how revenue limits correlated with salaries. Interestingly, school districts that had more revenues per pupil and bigger just bigger bank accounts did not pay people proportionately more. They just had more people. So
Hmm.
that was their sort of competitive advantage, was you weren't going to be overloaded. Maybe you were going to have a lower class size, or maybe there was going to be that specialist who's going to take care of things like English learners, or simply have more special education teachers with lower caseloads. But
Sure.
there was not a relative difference with regard to their salary amounts. They were still using the marketplace to sort of set salaries. They just had more people.
That's really interesting. And an interesting decision about how to allocate your resources.
Yeah,
Maybe that points to what parents want out of their schools. Um,
right.
but it still leaves us with the issue we initially began with: costs rise for schools. So how do you cover them?
Yeah,
We've seen a lot of school funding referenda,
yeah,
and those have been passing at pretty high rates, though the rate of passage seems to have fallen a little bit recently.
yeah,
Um, but we just come back to the dilemma of how do we fund public education, including vouchers and charter schools. And the legislature and the governor made real changes in that last
Right.
year.
You bet.
Um, it almost looked like an old-fashioned day of politics in which everybody got something and nobody got everything they
There you
wanted.
go. Yeah. Like the days of Tommy Thompson, right? That's why he was in the office for so long. Well, it sort of leads into this next question that we wanted to talk about with regard to school satisfaction in your community. And the more people feel invested in their community, the more likely they are to be willing to pay more and to raise their property taxes. Talk
Yeah.
about that if you would.
Satisfaction has been running well over 50% since we first started asking about it back in 2012 or so. But there have been some declines in satisfaction in recent years and rise in dissatisfaction. Um, Still substantially more satisfied than dissatisfied, but I would not take lightly the 10 or 12% increase in dissatisfied people. Um, what we've really seen is that satisfied had been running in the high 70s and more recently has dropped off into the mid 70s. While the dissatisfied has ticked up, um, like I said, a bit, it's now running at about 30% dissatisfied, having previously been a little at 20% or slightly below 20%.
Okay.
Um, when we zoom in on that a little bit, what we see is that um, the increase is a little higher in the somewhat dissatisfied rather than it being a substantial bump up in the very dissatisfied.
I see.
There are very dissatisfied. I don't want to underplay that, but that's been running under 10%, bumped up in recent years to about 11 or 12%, and in the latest poll was back down a little under 10%. So the sort of angry parent, angry, mobilized constituency is pretty low and really did not fluctuate a whole lot in the last 4 years or so. But the somewhat dissatisfied has grown a little bit and a little more steadily and is up by maybe 5 to 8% over the last 6 years or so. Um, Meanwhile, very satisfied is down a little bit, while satisfied or somewhat satisfied has remained relatively stable. Um, so I think we come away with the picture that if you think on state issues, education is a hot button issue, it should be recognized that when we ask about the schools in your community, and that's why we ask it that way, you can ask people about schools everywhere, but what do I know about schools in Green Bay? Um, um, and so that's why we focus on the community because that's closer to home. If you're a parent, that's where your kids may go or at least could go. Um, and that's the reason for the in your community focus on this. Um, but I do think it's worth appreciating that uh, most people in the state, and especially people outside of Milwaukee, have quite positive views of their community schools. And that's true in the more Republican areas of the north and west of the state and the more Democratic areas around Madison and the south and southwest of the state. Um, People in the Milwaukee suburbs are very satisfied with their schools. It really is a Milwaukee City phenomena where in all the years we've been doing this, the greatest dissatisfaction is the people in Milwaukee. The most satisfied are those in Madison and Green Bay and the north and west of the state. And in the Milwaukee suburbs, satisfaction is fairly high, maybe not quite as high as it is, say, in the Green Bay area.
Well, so I wanted to ask you, that's interesting because of this sort of recent push to have sort of a more partisan approach to school board elections and school board politics. Are you seeing any changes in that regard?
We don't ask about school board elections, so I don't have direct evidence on that. The reason is that we don't know where a respondent lives in terms of which school district they're in.
Sure.
And asking about school board elections, which are low visibility, low turnout affairs,
Yeah.
is really hard. And so we stay away from that. I mean, obviously, there's plenty of evidence from the last few years of much more hotly contested school board elections, those becoming more partisan affairs than maybe they once were. And certainly, passions in some places have risen quite a bit about schools and school policy.
But it's interesting that you're not seeing a significant raise in the dissatisfaction levels, even in light of the fact that some people are trying to run on the issue that our schools are off track, et cetera.
No, that's exactly right. I think um, one of the things we were watching for in the last few years was exactly that. Were we seeing um, the kind of angry voices about education
Right.
permeating out to the public at large? And at most, we saw that 2 or 3 point increase in the percent very dissatisfied, but still holding no more than about 12% at its top. This general increase of a modest degree, but not nothing, in the somewhat dissatisfied, but that didn't seem to capture the sort of dynamics of those school board contests recently. Um, but I do think you'd be fair to conclude that people are a little more unhappy with their schools, or put it positively, a little less happy with their schools. But the idea that there's a popular uprising of large numbers of people very unhappy, that we don't see.
No.
One side point here is we don't see much difference between people who are parents of school age children
Oh,
and people
interesting.
who are not.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe we would see a difference, but it doesn't appear that satisfaction with the schools varies much with whether you have a kid in school or not, or at least school age. We don't know what school they go to, but
Right.
school age.
Any sort of crosstab analysis between lower taxes raising funding and the school satisfaction? Do you have that?
Yeah, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there is certainly um, those more satisfied are more willing to support K-12 funding. But you also see things that show up in school funding studies all the time. The older you are, the more you're against raising property taxes, right?
Yeah.
And so there is a decline in support for K-12 spending with age. It does seem like it comes down through the middle age and then maybe comes up a little bit. Maybe that's grandparents
Okay. Yeah,
deciding to support schools a little more, though it's not a big change.
sure.
But generally, support for funding goes down, and conversely, concern for property taxes goes up
Well,
with
overall,
age.
yeah, and overall satisfaction numbers in the 70s, I think any politician would be pretty happy with that.
Oh yes, and we do see important differences with race, with Black parents being especially less satisfied with their schools than either white or Hispanic parents. Um, White and Hispanic satisfaction is similar in the 70s, but Black satisfaction is in the mid 40s, below 50%. Again, where do most Black parents in the state live is in Milwaukee or Madison or Racine or Beloit. Um, so it's kind of a concentrated set of districts that have substantial Black parents living in,
Yeah,
or Black people, I should say.
sure.
Um, but it is striking that there is that difference in satisfaction among Black parents, or
Really.
again, I keep saying parents, Black people, not
Right.
not separately parents.
Yeah, respondents.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That it's and disheartening to be sure. It's
Yeah.
unfortunate. Well, let's talk now. The next section is with regard to voucher support, private versus public school support. It's been kind of a big effort in there in the past, and you alluded to it earlier that the governor and the legislature came to agreement about funding in this last budget.
Yeah. Yeah. And this gave, an increase in funding for voucher schools and an increase for public schools. So I think that was the sort of accommodation of interests on both sides after a period of, sort of frozen negotiations between the governor and the legislature.
Yeah.
Um, I think that was a substantial step forward. There are certainly people who still oppose vouchers in the state, but we've had them for a very long time now. And the question is, if our education budget is now absolutely including public schools, public charter schools, other kinds of charter schools, and voucher schools of various kinds, then the question is simply, how do we divide the dollars to do all of that, or provide the dollars to do all that?
Right.
And I think this last budget was the example of providing the dollars rather than dividing the dollars,
Sure.
because the debate is often framed in money for public schools, and if you're not going to do that, then you're taking that money and giving it to voucher schools. And we see that how you frame this question matters a lot, which I'll talk about in a second. But what we got in this last budget was increased funding for both vouchers and public schools. And again, some people were still unhappy with that. They still wanted more for their side of the deal, or possibly less for the other side. But I think the satisfaction with the outcome of that budget was pretty good. We saw reasonable satisfaction, or approval, I should say, of both the legislature and the governor after this last budget was finished. And I think we might have seen a decline in those if people were really dissatisfied with this. We didn't ask specifically about the budget deal, I should say. But I mentioned it matters so much how you frame this question. When we ask about vouchers, we've asked different kinds of questions over the years because they've been driven by what the legislature was debating at the time.
Okay.
So at one point, we asked about expanding vouchers beyond the Milwaukee area.
Right.
Then we asked about how many students or income limits, and so on. So all of those different questions have been driven by the politics of the moment. But more recently, we've tried to look into how much the framing of public versus voucher spending, how it's framed, and what effect that has on people's answers. And one part of the answer is that when we look at, would you favor or oppose vouchers for all students so they can attend the school of their choice? Sorry, let me read you the actual question.
Sure.
Do you favor or oppose allowing all students statewide to use publicly funded vouchers to attend private or religious schools if they wish to do so? And this was June of 2023 that we asked this.
Okay.
54% favor that, 44% are opposed to it. So that's an example of a plus 10% majority favoring vouchers for everybody and for private schools and religious schools. But in the same survey, we asked a different question. If you were making the choice for the next Wisconsin state budget between increasing state support for students to attend private schools or increasing state support for public schools, which would you favor? Private schools or public schools? So here we're deliberately making people into that it's one or the other, a choice between them. There, 28% favor funding for private schools and vouchers, 66% favor funding for public schools. So I think those two questions taken in the same month and before the budget deal was finalized is a good example that when you think about the value of school choice in its sort of generic sense, there's a lot of support for that. When you frame it as a zero-sum game between public and private or voucher schools, then there's a lot of support for public school funding. And remember, most parents do send their kids to public schools.
Right.
So there's a big majority there. The issue is whether it has to be framed as that, or whether it's a matter of providing resources for both. Again, this last budget tried to achieve some of that, but it doesn't deny that there's an underlying tension between this, and whenever it's presented as a choice, an either or choice, then it becomes more divisive and the public schools tend to win on those kinds of questions. Um, but when it's framed as letting parents choose where to send their kids, then there's a majority support for funding for those vouchers.
Well, it's interesting. One of the things my board and I had conversations about in the last budget cycle was the fact that there was funding. There was over $2 billion available
Yeah.
for overall spend, and over $1 billion, I think, went into education. So it was not, the legislature could not say there's no money, right? It's
Yes,
just that
right.
we knew there was a lot and a lot of zeros there, and a lot of opportunities. And as you say, when it's not framed as a zero sum game, then I think people are magnanimous and want everybody to be able to access what best suits their situation.
Yeah.
Any correlations there, Dr. Franklin, between the voucher support question and race and ethnicity? We just talked about the dissatisfaction of people of color with their schools. Is there some differences there?
Yeah, there is greater support for vouchers in the Black and Hispanic communities. Um, I think that's unsurprising given low satisfaction with public schools among Black respondents. Um, Hispanic respondents, like I said, are about as satisfied as white respondents are, but also are in favor of vouchers. So you do see some differences there. Um, then there's division within the white community as well, and party plays a big role in this, with Republicans much more in favor of vouchers, regardless of their race. Democrats less supportive of vouchers, more supportive of public schools. So there are deep political divisions on this issue still. The racial aspect, I think, um, is confounded with where are the biggest and most successful voucher schools. And that's heavily concentrated in the Milwaukee area.
Yeah.
And that's where a lot of Hispanic population lives and takes advantage of vouchers, as well as substantial Black students, and whites as well. The size of um, the percent of school age children that go to public schools in the Milwaukee area is rather low, and certainly quite low compared to the percentages elsewhere in the state. And so that's where the benefits go disproportionately to Black and Hispanic families.
Well, that's interesting stuff, and I know there has been a lot of effort around school choice in the Milwaukee, Racine, and Kenosha, as you suggest,
Mm.
and now the statewide program. And the interesting to hear that historical look at how your questions have changed too.
Yeah.
The caps are coming off. I think they're going to happen soon. But have I've spoken with folks in the voucher movement, their contention is, and I think it's borne by the data, that they simply don't have capacity for everybody
Right.
who wants to get in. So you can take the caps off, but there's not enough room in those schools, and then
Right.
you get some of those battles with regard to the physical space and things like that.
Absolutely. And with declining enrollments in public schools, you have underutilized buildings, some of which the private schools or voucher schools would consider moving into, but that's a hot political topic too.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, I think there are a couple of things there that maybe are worth noting. One is simply the capacity of, I'm going to just call them generically voucher schools just for ease of speaking, rather than try to distinguish the types of schools that get voucher funding. But the funding mechanism, especially with this recent increase, does provide significant resources for those voucher schools to
Yeah,
support themselves and potentially expand as
right. Yeah.
student demand is there and more students do bring in more voucher money. Um, I think that when we get out of the more urban areas of the state, I mean, larger cities. So I'm not talking about Milwaukee here. I'm talking about Milwaukee, but also Green Bay and Madison, primarily, and maybe the smaller cities. But it goes to the question of, we're in a period of declining population in the K-12 age groups. And at the moment, there doesn't seem to be a turnaround for new growth in that age group. So school enrollments, no matter what kind of school, are going to be declining for the foreseeable future. So that means fewer people in any kind of public or voucher schools around the state. Then we have areas of the state with generally declining population, though recently there has been some upsurge in population. I want to put that positive note out there as well.
Yeah.
But we've seen an awful lot of public school consolidation in the more rural parts of the state, where towns that used to be able to have their own elementary school or their own high school have found it necessary to consolidate with relatively nearby schools, but in some cases, quite a gap geographically.
Yeah.
So the question here is expanding voucher schools in these areas that are already having trouble sustaining public schools
Yes.
is a different kind of competition. It's not so much the economic competition, but to put it one way, it's do you have enough people to field a football team or a basketball team?
Yeah,
And
right.
you know, uh, so I'm just trying to make the point here that um, there is the economics of public and voucher funding and the broad education system, but there's also the literal student body problem. If we don't have as many bodies in K-12 schools now as we did 10 years ago, and even more now than we will have in 10 years. This is going to be another kind of complicated system of how do we deal with this sort of two system affair where there's the sort of classic public schools, but then there's also the voucher schools in the same communities competing for the same number or a shrinking number of students.
Yeah, I was a superintendent in a small rural district that the private school was just starting to accept vouchers right when I was leaving. And we were having an interesting conversation with regard to the question of whether or not that school district would levy for those funds in order to keep the dollars available for the students who were staying. But it is a significant challenge when those dollars, go to the private school. The other thing that just to extend the consolidation note that you made earlier, school districts will close small rural elementary schools and consolidate into their central towns. In fact, the River Valley School District, Spring Green, went through that not too long ago, and they closed multiple small rural and elementary schools and bused all those kids to those central locations. But maintaining those small rural schools is quite expensive. And so, you kind of offset the busing costs, but you come out ahead as a district. And yet, nevertheless, it comes with a lot of just a lot of frustration for people who were able to send their children to the nice little elementary school down the road versus a half an hour bus ride or more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, let's turn to special education now, and this is an area that I've got a fair amount of understanding and background in, and that the challenge with special education in particular that we're seeing after COVID is there was a lot of isolation. We're seeing a lot of challenges with reading skill development. Certainly the numbers of children with autism are going up, and the challenges with regard to identifying those needs. We've got kids, there's a fairly strong correlation between poverty and disability. Certainly issues with lead poisoning in older housing where it has not been remediated. Interesting things there. And I know you've asked about special education funding, and I know that there's going to be a push. I saw Dale Kuyenga, the Milwaukee Metropolitan Area Chamber of Commerce, talking about this, that they're interested in pushing this issue. I know AEF, our organization, is planning to continue our advocacy around it, and there are other groups too. What's the public perception there, Dr. Franklin?
Yeah, when we've asked about it has been when the legislature was particularly considering what to do about the budget with respect to special ed. I think the first thing we find is big support for fully, quote, fully funding special education costs. Um, I don't think that's because most people have much idea about what special education means or what it costs. But certainly for schools, it's a very important funding element because depending on the nature of the special needs, those can be extremely expensive.
Yeah.
And how are they funded is a critical question for school administrators. Um, for the public, I think it's simply a consensus that schools should provide the needs for or the means to support students with special needs. And so we get big majorities in favor of doing that. What we've never done is, again, pose it as a question of trade offs
Oh,
or pose it as a more direct and pointed question about where do those funds come from? Do they come from the school district budget? Do they come from some dedicated state budget? Um, and stories abound about how expensive that can get in particular circumstances. But now we're digging down into details of school budgets and school programs
yeah,
that most people don't have much experience with directly.
sure.
Or if they do, they may be very happy with the resources that their child got, or they may be very unhappy with unmet needs. So it's hard to understand that. And in our surveys, we simply don't have enough parents to be able to dive down into that group of parents that have special needs experience. So I'm sorry to say we've not been able to ask about that.
Well, but you what you do have is really very important, the idea of fully funding. You know, we talk about that question, and in fact, I had a an opportunity to talk with someone who was in the Federal Department of Education, when the IDA, the original Education of the Handicapped Act, was in front of President Ford. He was actually in the Oval Office talking with President Ford and others about this legislation and about the bill and should the president sign the bill. President Ford's biggest concern was reportedly that it would not be fully funded,
Yeah.
and it would be a significant burden on the states. Certainly was something that I think many people feel is the right thing to do, and I know
Yeah.
our organization certainly does. But the funding question is really quite challenging, and if memory serves, the funding was something like 2/3 or 70% was supposed to come from both state and federal sources. We've done some work working with folks from R.W. Baird just a couple of years back. And we were able to identify the dollar amount that was being transferred from regular education sources to special education to cover the shortfall. But we took that dollar amount for every school district and divided it by the number of non-disabled children in the district to identify the dollars per non-disabled child coming out of the regular classroom to backfill what was not adequately funded from the state and the federal government. And that was on the order of thousands of dollars.
Yeah.
You know, some districts 2,000 and up per student, per non-disabled student. And it was really quite compelling. We clearly, again, we want to do the right thing. And in fact, I'm proud to say that Wisconsin's disability law predates federal law. So we've had our heads in the right places about this for a long time. But again, it is very expensive.
Yeah, and it's a challenging debate to have because, as I say, people in our surveys are overwhelmingly in favor of providing these kinds of special education programs, but are ill-informed about the costs. And when faced with those costs, what would the legislature be able or willing to do towards fully funding those costs?
Yeah.
And what does that mean in terms of sort of a blank check for any costs that are incurred? I don't have any pretense of knowing much about this or being an expert on it. So I should stay away from the policy debate. But
Okay.
I do think when we ask about vouchers and public schools, I think people don't know the details, but they know enough to understand that there could be trade-offs there or there could be accommodations to both.
Sure.
But when we get to something like special education, I think people are very much in favor of it in principle, but the policy debate has not really informed people a lot about what the costs and what the trade-offs might be. And if you were going to make trade-offs, where would you make them? Right now, we make them by basically having to pay those costs out of funding that would go to non-special needs students. Maybe that's the right decision to make, but it's a conversation that we haven't had much of. Um, I'll just mention that in our upcoming June survey, among other things, we are asking about whether people perceive the special education programs as a success or not.
Oh, wow.
And
Excellent.
so we will, and again, I want to be clear, it's not, we also include a don't know response on that because I
Right.
expect a lot of people will simply honestly say, you know, I really don't know about that. But
Yeah.
it will be some information about how people perceive special needs programs in the schools.
Well, we might have to have interview number two.
I'd be happy to do it.
That'd be great.
We're gonna have a special module on education, so we'll be asking a fair number of education questions.
Oh, that's great. Good to know. And
Yeah.
we certainly appreciate your time in talking about this. The last thing I wanted to ask you was about education as an issue in voters' sort of
Right.
order of priority. And I saw something nationally about this that did not have education. It, certainly the economy was there, immigration was there, a variety of things, in terms of larger scale international issues, wars, etc. Education not on the list.
Right. Um, and I'm partly guilty of that. We're in the presidential race. We ask about 8 issues that people are concerned about. We don't include education in that.
Yes. Yeah.
Partly that's because it's not central to presidential elections, whereas if it's the gubernatorial race, we would.
Yeah.
In 2022, we asked about how concerned you were about a dozen different issues that we asked about over the year. Um, and the economy and inflation was at the top of the list. That's no surprise to anybody. Um, but education was included in that set, and it tended to be towards the lower end of the 12 issues that we asked about.
Okay.
Not unimportant in an absolute sense, but relatively less in front of voters in the 2022 election. I think we might have seen that higher in earlier elections. I think certainly in 2014,
Yeah.
maybe in 2018, we would have seen it up, but that would be driven more by the agendas of the governors. And obviously, Tony Evers was making education his calling card. Governor Walker had education as an important issue from his terms as well. In 2022, I don't think the governor's race made education a preeminent part of the campaign in the way that maybe 2018 or 2014 did.
Sure. Yeah, it's interesting because I do know that Governor Evers and then candidate Michaels were talking about some of the reading issues that had come out, and I can't recall how much of an issue the voucher question was
Yeah.
at that time.
Yeah, one version of this that we asked at the appropriate time was about achievement tests, and especially tests, for voucher schools. And that was, a hot issue because voucher schools were reluctant to be brought under the same testing regime as the public schools are. Part of the virtues of being a private voucher school is you get to make your own regulations. But that also did raise the question at the time about how were we to evaluate the quality of voucher schools if they were exempt from the testing requirements. When we asked people there, a substantial percentage said that they thought parents could assess quality and didn't need tests to do it.
Well,
I think that is giving a little praise to parents, but it's a questionable decision. I mean, you can trust parents to make their own decisions. I understand that kind of argument, but I can tell you, having gone through 12 years of my daughter in schools, uh, I was not intimately aware of school performance during that time. And I don't know how any parent would have been, um, as just simply a parent observing their child and their homework and things like that, let alone digging deep into the school achievement tests.
Well, and this is certainly something that I think COVID opened a lot of eyes for folks about exactly what the content of the curriculum was and what the sorts of things that were, uh, what our instruction looked like. What were we doing
Yeah,
in those online classes, which certainly didn't match up well with doing a chemistry lab, et cetera. But
yeah,
nevertheless, it was, I think, pretty eye-opening.
yeah.
Well, fascinating stuff. Thank you so very much. Really
Happy to
interesting
do it. Uh,
conversation. And I will watch for the press release on the next survey. When will
yeah.
that come out?
June 26th. And I will tell you